Greetings, comrades. This is a video I've been meaning to make for a long time, and it's a subject that I found with the fast pace of events difficult at times to analyse. But as time has gone on, the picture has become much clearer. Today I'll talk about the slow rise of ultranationalism in Europe. And this is going to be the beginning of a series of videos on the subject. So, this is not the rise of a new ideology or a new movement, rather it's a very old idea which has found a new way to express itself in the 21st century, and old social forces looking for new ways to assert themselves. But what constitutes this ultranationalism? What common bonds do these organisations hold with the diverse nations of the continent? To describe it as a movement, coalition, or even an ideology isn't quite accurate. The new nationalism is portrayed better as a sequence of ideas and sentiments which find expression in movements and propaganda. First, however, we must describe the conditions in which these new ideas, or this new form of expressing ideas, was formed. Now, back in the honeymoon period of the unipolar world, in the 90s, the Eastern Bloc was being auctioned to capitalism, NATO had pulled off a string of imperialist wars, and the financial sector was booming. This period might well be described as the heyday of globalization, the end of ideologies, or even the eternal victory lap of big capitalism. With the economy booming, the high standards of living for increasing numbers of Western citizens had blinded the world to the festering social turmoil within their nation's underbellies, as well as the corruption within their highest circles. Now, the Soviet threat of nuclear annihilation had basically receded into distant memory and was replaced by optimistic footage of skirmishes in the Third World. Western political forces had smudged into a tepid centrism. Bourgeois leaders, captivated by their own success, became alienated from the population. And the traditional expressions of the long-violated far right had all but lost its voice on the political stage, expressed in the remnants of neo-Nazi groups, the religious far right, and New World Order conspiracy nuts. Their ideas considered vulgar in the heyday of globalized capitalism, the rightists were unable to resist the wave of multiculturalism, tolerance, and civil rights spreading through the bourgeois governments. Now, imperialism cannot sustain itself long, however, without an external threat with which to unify the masses. This external threat arrived on the 11th of September 2001 with the destruction of the Twin Towers. The string of US-led imperialist incursions in the Middle East and Central Asia were met with strong opposition in Europe, with even the far-right British National Party exploiting the anti-war sentiments for their own political gains. The strongest opposition came from Europe's growing and increasingly vocal Muslim minority, with several successful and numerous attempted attacks committed by newly radicalized militants. Paranoia about the trustworthiness of Muslims in the West had reached a fever pitch. The bourgeois, of course, exacerbated the growing sense of fear, pumping out near-hysterical propaganda about the threat of terrorism and seizing the opportunity to strengthen police powers. Now, right-wing nativism had long been suppressed in the many nations of Europe, and were greatly rejected by all except neo-Nazis and ultra-conservatives in favour of diversity, multiculturalism, and liberal values of the day in the public forum. However, the mask of tolerance in bourgeois politics was allowed to slip during the height of Islamophobia, creating a contradiction in thought. On the one hand, promoting diversity, and on the other, spreading fear about a particular minority. This contradiction at last gave the hard right a platform with which to connect with ordinary working people openly. Now, the loss of sovereignty amongst individual European states was also creating a breeding ground for resentful nationalists. The process of standardization and legal regulations, including the reduction of immigration controls, was received badly by a lot of citizens, irate at the lack of democratic participation in the forming of these laws, as well as their perception of having been imposed by a foreign power. And these are the three pillars of European nationalism: sovereignty, immigration, and the perceived threat of Islamization of Europe. These 3 points have allowed the galvanization of a movement of diverse and sometimes even contradictory organizations into a real political current in Western Europe. I hate this shitty tobacco. So, what are the constituent parts of this movement? It's worth noting that many of these groups have existed for quite a period of time, but lacked any narrative of social conflict with which they could be united. I believe these groups can be categorized as being political parties, single issue groups, think tanks, and street movements. Now, the political parties on the whole tend to be of a right wing populist persuasion, with some groups emerging out of the ashes of European neo fascism, like the BNP and the French National Front, while others out of the extreme conservative wings of Europe's centre right parties, for example, Conservatives. And these come in the form of your UKIPs and your English Democrats. Now, while they vary on policies and extremeness in ideology, a common thread of ideas can be detected in all these parties: anti-immigration, opposition to LGBT rights and feminism, anti-communism, anti-EU, characterising it as an oppressive force, nationalism and patriotism, focusing on the cultural identity and the indigenous ethnicity of the nation, and opposition to progressive politics, perception of liberal bias in the media, and anti-trade unionism, just to name a few. And these parties can be broadly defined as nationalist, conservative, traditionalist, and more importantly, reactionary. And they find support with the corresponding sentiments in the general population who are frustrated with mainstream bourgeois politics. Some parties have taken advantage of the social democratic parties' move away from the traditional welfare state in favour of deregulated capitalism, and have attracted support from disgruntled patriotic social democratic voters, frustrated because they perceive the social development in modern Europe as having been thrust upon them without their consent, thus alienating them from the current mainstream politics. Street movements and protests have done much to draw attention to the growing far right, the most successful of these being the English Defence League. Other defence leagues have formed around the different countries of Europe, although none receiving the support enjoyed by the EDL. This is due in part to the resistance of a much more militant anti-fascist movement on the continent, while the EDL has only met the lacklustre response from the SWP-directed Unite Against Fascism. Aside from the defence leagues, many single-issue groups hold protests, as do various parties. In some areas of Europe, neo-Nazis and fascists also have quite a prominent street movement. However, they lack the support of the populist and conservative movements. The various think tanks and associated authors constitute the intelligentsia and the ideologues of the movement, concentrating on providing articles, blogs, commentary, and other propaganda for the movement, providing ways to legitimise their backwardsness in the 21st century. So, what is the guiding thread linking these movements into a political force? The thought process aims to give a narrative to a series of grievances this movement has with mainstream politics: the allowing of mass immigration in Europe, the loss of sovereignty to the EU, the rejection of conservative values in favour of liberal values by society, globalisation and monopoly capitalism swallowing local and small businesses, and the so-called leftist fifth column aimed at destroying Europe. The line of thought at its most extreme goes like this: the left is trying to destroy Europe and the sovereignty of European nations using an increasingly centralised EU and by Islamising Europe through mass immigration. And apparently this must be stopped by instituting a firm conservative and traditional culture in Europe, and by eradicating the influence of leftists and the Islamists, as well as the liberals who act as sad dupe for both those groups. Within their movement, there is a slight divide over whether or not to support Zionism. However, the mainstream anti-Islam thread of the movement supports Israel. Now, many of the movements have their own kind of national particularities, such as Ulster loyalism found in the EDL, and some have a much more moderate approach to tackling Islam. However, the sense of conspiracy is spreading to every corner of the movement. The ultimate expression of this paranoia is found in Anders Behring Breivik, who was willing to carry out this line for all the way to its bitter conclusion. And the aftermath of the Norway atrocities brought forth a wave of apologists for Breivik's beliefs. However, it also strengthened resistance to them. Breivik's 2,500-page manifesto, which drew heavily from the writings of the New Right's intelligentsia, showed how disconnected this train of thought is at its later stages to the thinking of ordinary Europeans. Breivik predicted that his crude attempt at propaganda of the deed would precipitate a conservative revolution rather than outrage and disgust at the murder of children. That said, it's not too late for it to become a self-fulfilling prophecy later in time. Breivik was not the first conservative terrorist, and I doubt that he will be the last. The neo-McCarthyism and anti-trade unionism that's worked its way into the far right in recent times is also a dangerous current. A new fascination with the cultural Marxism conspiracy has provided a narrative for militant opposition to mainstream politics. Even the EDL has accused the Labour Party of being infested with communists as well as the trade unions, chillingly echoing Breivik's delusional branding of his victims in the Norwegian Labour Party's youth wing as communists. This thinking ties together both the New Right's most vocal opponents, the far left, anarchists and communists, with trade unions and the mainstream political elite as a front for Marxists in league with Islamists trying to destroy the nations, portraying rightists as patriotic defenders of national values through conservatism and traditionalism. It's important to understand it's important when trying to understand hysterical reaction to social and economic developments in Europe. We take a look at the role of different members of different classes in the movement. We see within the parties the usual mix of a desire for national independence from foreign business, including preference for native workers and producing commodities locally, and encouraging small businesses, and reactionary responses to social changes. These programs give much benefit to the nationalist petty bourgeois and bourgeois classes in a particular nation and stand in opposition to the desires and programs of the more globalized and mainstream bourgeoisie who depend on their connection with foreign trade and imperialism. At the grassroots, the movement enjoys support from reactionary sections of the working class and the lumpen proletariat, especially those who have lost jobs due to outsourcing or are frustrated with competition caused by increased immigration in the job market, as well as from disenfranchised sections of other classes whose stature has been damaged by the processes of corporatism, globalization, and monopoly capitalism. The national bourgeois and petty bourgeois buildings have been in the background of Western politics for eons. But what is significant is when sections of the working class begin to join with them. It is that makes a real difference. It is their alienation from both mainstream and far-left politics that has given a vacuum for the New Right's poisonous ideology to fill. And I shall talk about how the left could and how the left is responding to these developments in my next video on the subject. Red salutes, comrades.